So Lewis is correct. I'm still editor-in-chief of the Neurosurgery publications until August, when I'll hand it off to Dr. Konzioka. So I've been asked to talk about writing the manuscript. So here we go. So the first thing is there are many resources available to learn about this. You can residents can learn from faculty and other colleagues, and there are lots of seminars and courses out there on manuscript preparation. The internet is replete with sources, as are many reference books. One particular source that I like, that we were instrumental in putting together, is this series on the CNS website. It's free. It consists of 6 modules about how to design a study, what you need to do to submit a manuscript, elements of study design, statistical analyses, the database development that's required for many of the clinical studies, and then finally, how to prepare a manuscript. So that's the URL. So you can copy that if you wish, or take a screenshot so you can use it to source that information. There's also other journals. Nature, for example, the Nature Publishing Group has a wonderful series of webinars online, so that you can use that as a source of information on how to prepare a research paper. Here's another source that's also available on writing and publishing, gives you all kinds of tips and tricks for manuscript preparation. Okay, so what are the parts of the manuscript? As you see here, title is the first thing, abstract, introduction, and so on, all the way to references. But I would submit that this sequence of events is not necessarily the sequence you should utilize when you're actually preparing a manuscript. For example, the first thing that you could write, the first section of the manuscript that you can write, even before you have one data point, even before you have one result or one chart or figure, is your methods, because the methods are the basis upon which the study is performed. So you should be able to write the methods, whether it's a clinical design or a laboratory project or systematic review or whatever it is. You should be able to write the methodology first, and then following that, the other elements will follow, ending and culminating with the last piece, which is the abstract, which is the key material that you're going to send off, and that's what the editors are going to read first, as well as the title, right? Now, so going on to the specific sections of the paper, starting with the title. The title is by far and away the most important part of the paper. It is what will attract or repel the editor or a reviewer from the paper. So the title may actually determine whether the paper gets read in the first place. If the title pretty much turns the editor off, or becomes apparent that it's not worth reviewing, that may be the end of the journey for that paper. So avoid long rambling titles, keep the titles active, crisp, and to the point, informative, so it's easy to tell what it is. Avoid acronyms and abbreviations in the title, spell things out so people don't have to guess what you're saying. And as you see, I gave 3 examples of the title of the paper, and it's pretty clear that the one that is most informative, most active, and most crisp is the first one, the effects, the middle one, the heat melts ice. The first one, the effects of heat on ice, could be anything, maybe no effect, maybe whatever. Whereas the active title, heat melts ice, is pretty clear and clearer than the other 2 options. The abstract, as I said, is the most critical part of the paper in terms of assessment, overall assessment, because it is in the abstract that the main objective of the manuscript will be placed. The most important results should be put in the abstract. The punchline, the conclusions and significance should be in the bottom part of the abstract. And again, as with the title, you should avoid acronyms and abbreviations that are not easy for anyone to figure out. And it should be revised until flawless, because as I said, that's what is going to first take the attention of the editor. Okay, so what's the second piece of the manuscript? Well, the introduction, right? So what's the introduction about? Well, as the word implies, it introduces the paper. So first thing people want to know is, why is this study important, or why is it necessary, or why was it done? And that's the first question. Second question is, you've got to provide a brief setting, a background, because if someone is going to read the paper, they want to know what's been done about this before, what's the story, what's the backdrop. And so that background goes in the introduction. And then the next piece is the introduction has to state the question that was the issue at hand, and the central question of the hypothesis of the experiment. And then finally, a one-sentence summary of the findings at the bottom of the abstract. And then you've got a really good product to send. All right, methods and materials. I said it before, I'll say it again. This should be written before or whilst the research is still in progress. It can be detailed enough so that anyone can, or should be detailed enough so that if one wants to copy the experiment or the design of the study, it can be done without having to wonder what you did. And if it's work that you have done before, you can reference yourself where appropriate. Here's where you need to talk about what you did in terms of human or animal use and approvals that are relevant to that, and so on. And then the next portion of the manuscript is the results, the data, the findings. And here's where you need as few words as possible. The less text, the better. The more illustrative material, figures, tables, charts, graphs, icons, and so on, anything but words, as few words as possible. And you want to be able to present the main findings to the reader. Here's where color is also very important, various enhancements, different fonts, and so on and so on. And then the bottom of the manuscript is called the discussion. Here's where people get lost. It's like walking through a forest. They just get lost. And the way to avoid getting lost and make your discussion worthwhile is to follow these rules. First thing is, at the first paragraph, what you want to do is answer the question that was posed in the introduction. All right, you wanted to find out the infection rate of craniotomies on trauma patients. So the first thing your discussion is, we found that the infection rate of in trauma patients was X. So you basically started the discussion with some factual information. And then people want to know, how does this relate to existing knowledge? Well, we found that our infection rate was half of that has been previously reported in the literature and twice what was expected. I mean, whatever it is, you should put that in there. So you set your results against the backdrop of extant literature and what are the facts known in the existing space. And then the third thing you want to do in the discussion right after that is to discuss the weaknesses, the discrepancies, and the limitations. And here's where subheadings are useful. And you might want to say, for example, although we found that this infection rate was half of what was expected, our paper may not be accurate in that we only studied half the number of patients and we're not sure about the robustness of our data. Okay, so that's a weakness or a discrepancy. So that goes in there. And then you've got to say what's new without exaggerating why it's important. And you do not want to rehash all the results and every chart and every data point. That is not necessary. Subheadings are good to organize your thought process and make it easy for people to digest and figure out what you're saying. And then finally, the conclusion, 2-3 sentences, maybe a paragraph perhaps at most, as to what the conclusions are, summary statement, perspectives, and maybe future work or implications for the study. All right. And then you finally, you get to the reference section. And here's where people just are very sloppy because they may not read the reference. They may just be putting references that were cited in some other paper, and they may not be relevant, or maybe there are references from 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and there's more recent work that would have been useful to look at. And this is, you need to be a little tidy here Be highly selective. You don't need to reference every last work. You need to reference the ones that are most pertinent and important to your paper. It helps if you yourself have read the reference, so you know exactly what you're quoting and not quoting. And of course, submit the material with the correct style for the journal. Some things you don't want to do that are here and that journals will look out for. They'll look out for duplicate submissions, plagiarism. They'll ask about conflicts of interest. That's very important, particularly if you're doing things like device studies or pharmaceutical studies, that sort of thing. Make sure that all your animal use concerns and disclosures relevant to human use are also properly taken care of, or else they'll send it back to you with queries. To optimize your submission to a journal, make sure you pay attention to some of the logistics. They're simple things, but they may delay the process of analyzing and reviewing and ultimately publishing your paper. Check the format and make sure you've got the right article type. So if it's a clinical study, say it's a clinical study. If it's a review, say it's a review. If it's a laboratory research, say it's a laboratory research. That's very helpful. So it goes into the right category. Some journals use blinding, some do not. We use double blinding. So if there's blinding in the journal, make sure you strip your journal article of any identifications that are pertinent. Put in the conflicts and the disclosures so people understand upfront where you're coming from. Again, if you're putting in pictures, photographs, surgical videography, quality is very important, resolution is very important, and so on. Materials should be cited, particularly if they belong to other people, all the relevant permissions and so forth. And then for journals that use cover art, if you want to have cover art, you may want to send that in as well. Some of the other things I've mentioned include this, and I'll pay attention to one thing is design of studies. Make sure that the controls are there, the hypothesis is adequately stated, and be sure to use the guidelines for the Equator Network. Few things about writing and brevity and that sort of thing. Obviously, if the science is bad, the writing can't overcome it. But at the same token, even if the science is good, you need to write well so that you can communicate. Good, definitive, specific, concrete language is important. And if you have trouble with it, send it off to someone whose first language is English. There are also editing services and so forth that are available. They're a little bit expensive, but the cheaper ones out in India. They've got a lot of good editorial services that are not as expensive as in the West. Be brief, be brief, be brief. The journals have a finite amount of space. Even in the digital space, there is a finite amount of space that journals want. So make sure that it's brief, and the shorter and the punchier the writing is, the better it is. Here's a paper that I always like to cite. This is Watson and Crick's paper in Nature in 1953. It's the story of life, basically describing their findings about the molecular structure of nucleic acids, the double helix. They put this all in one page. The entire shooting match is in one page, and you can see that they had 4 or 5 references. So if the story of life can be told in one page, I'm sure the story of neurosurgery can be told in one page. Here are some examples of how not to be verbose. I just cited a few. And here's one clause: a considerable amount of, that can go to many. So many as opposed to a considerable amount of. This is one word, and this is how many? 4 words. So this is a 30, excuse me, a huge reduction, a 75% reduction just by paying attention to brevity. Here's another one: on account of, because. There's another big example. So 30%, 70%, and so on. Many examples like that. Avoid redundant hyperbole. People tend to use this a lot. I'll give you some examples here. Extremely important. How about just important? Very deep. How about just deep? Overcrowded. How about just crowded? And so on. So these are some examples. There are many others. Most journals, ourselves included, use reporting guidelines that are made created by the Equator Network. and they cover various different kinds of article types. This is the consort, for example, for randomized control studies. They have various other ones for reviews and systematic reviews, case reports even, and so forth. It's always nice to train yourself in writing, and one of the best ways to train yourself other than reading and using the resources I mentioned earlier on the internet is actually to engage in reviews yourself. You can read other people's work, and that gives you an insight in common problems and mistakes. Major reasons for rejection about journals, from journals, is usually because of lack of novelty or poorly executed studies, either in the design or the actual execution. Sometimes because it's inappropriate for the journal, sometimes because it's badly written. When you get the paper back, it will have one of these recommendations. If you're lucky and it says revise, that's a good thing. Respond to the reviewers. Take very good, pay good attention to each comment, address each comment in detail and completely. And bear in mind that sometimes the reviewer is wrong. They don't know your work as much as you do. And if there's need to clarify, clarify. And make sure that every author participates in the review process. And beware of these predatory journals that are out there that are asking authors to pay exorbitant sums of money to publish and of dubious academic value, or sometimes not even peer review. So thank you very much. I think I'm right on time. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to entertain them. I'm sorry I have a shorter timeline than most of the other contributors because of another obligation this morning. Thank you.